So over the past month, I tried something completely new and I had a ton of fun and success doing it, so I wanted to take you guys along with me. If you're new here, my name is Zach and I love vintage stuff. I've been selling vintage clothing for around 9 years now, and typically every year I do 1 or 2 in-person vintage events, but this year I've already done 3 and I decided to take a little bit of a different approach this time. Instead of bringing only vintage clothing, this time, I brought 2 tables full of vintage non-clothing items. I'm calling these my chachki tables. And in this video, I'm going to show you guys some of my favorite things that I brought and how I found them. So let's get into it. So to start, this was my setup for Totally Rad Vintage Fest in New Jersey. Since it was in New Jersey, I had to put up this massive Sopranos poster. I found this a few months ago at the flea market for only $5. It was so big that I actually didn't know how to ship it or anything, so I just put it in my storage unit for a few months, and luckily I had it for this event. I wasn't really expecting anybody to want it, but I knew it was cool to put in the middle. But right when it started, somebody asked how much I wanted for it, and I said $50 off the top of my head, and it immediately sold. I sold it so fast that I didn't even think about what to put in its place, so the middle of my booth stayed empty for like an hour after that until I figured something out. One of my favorite things on the table was this vintage Winston cigarettes clock. I found this a few weeks ago at the flea market for only $20. It did have some scratches on the plastic, but it worked, and it was cool to see a light like this that wasn't beer related. I always find beer ones, but never really cigarette clocks like this. It's kind of crazy they have to put the Surgeon General warning even on something like a clock. I sold this thing pretty much immediately for $50. The same day at the flea market, I saw this guy pull up in a U-Haul, and he brought out boxes of random stuff. I picked up this basket full of like someone's junk drawer. The main reason I bought it was it had a bunch of vintage keychains down here at the bottom. I put them out on my table and I was selling them for like $3 a piece, 2 for $5. So I thought that was a pretty fun thing to have on the table. He also had this box full of framed interview magazine covers. I've never heard of this magazine, but I knew it was old because it was wrapped up in vintage newspaper. The seller let me throw anything I wanted into boxes and just gave me a price for everything. So I also grabbed this vintage genuine leather cowhide belt. Thought it was really cool. I'm not sure how old it is, but I'm guessing sometime around the 80s. Finding these interview magazines was crazy because I really was looking for something like this. I wanted something that people could buy and then immediately hang up. I find vintage posters all the time, but it's pretty hard to find a frame that fits vintage posters. Like all of them are just random sizes. So finding things that are already framed was crazy. It was like such perfect timing. I can't even describe it. Like I mentioned earlier, I don't know anything about Interview Magazine, but I really like the covers. You guys will have to let me know if this is something you would have picked up. There were 9 total in the box, and at the sale, I ended up selling 2 of them for $20 a piece, so I thought that was pretty great. One of the problems with only having 2 tchotchke tables was I didn't have enough room to display them all, so I only displayed a couple at a time. I'm sure I would have sold a couple more if they were all out at once. The U-Haul guy also had a few random pieces of clothing that I had to add in here because they were super cool. This vintage deep pile fleece jacket thing was awesome. I really like the faux leather up top. It looks like a sunrise. I've never heard of this brand before, but it's definitely like an 80s, maybe even 70s brand. One way to tell that it is older without even checking the tag is by looking at the zipper. You can see here it says Scoville. If you see a zipper with a word on it and not just YKK, it's a good indication that it is older and not some newly produced thing. Here's another jacket that I got from around the same time period. The guy ended up selling me everything for only $25. Although it seems like a lot of random stuff, it did add a lot to my booth, so this was a great pickup. Something I had on my table that I have no footage of finding are these vintage glass photo slides. I found these over the summer at a garage sale and I just didn't get a chance to film. I got these from a really old man who said they were his parents. They're dated 1911 on them. The ones that are in color are pictures from Japan, and the other ones are from the building of the Panama Canal. They're kind of crazy. I was able to sell them for $30. I'm not sure what they were actually worth, but I got them for basically for free, so I thought that was a fair price. Something else I had for sale that could potentially be really old is this vintage sign, and you guys are gonna have to help me out with this one because I'm pretty stumped. So the other day I was at the flea market and I saw one of the sellers bringing this out. He didn't really know where exactly it originally came from. He said he thought it might have came from an old movie theater display, but he wasn't sure. And after posting a TikTok about it, it became even more unclear. People were saying that it might be a cigarette advertisement or an anti-cigarette advertisement. Nobody could really really give me a solid answer, but one thing people were pretty confident about is that it's Rudolph Valentino, a silent movie actor. If anybody knows anything about this, I would love to know. It's made of wood and really heavy. That same day at the flea market, I found a few other vintage things too. I found this bag full of vintage posters. I barely looked at them at all. I turned a few over and they seemed like racing related. The guy wanted $10 for all of them, so I thought I'll take the risk on that. There's a lot of really cool ones in here, and since this is YouTube, I have unlimited time, so I'm gonna go through all of them. One thing I really like about this poster is all the details in the background. I wonder if somebody actually painted this picture. I'm sure they did. When I found them, I thought they were all racing related, but this 1995 Philadelphia Eagles poster was in here too. It's made by Miller Lite. If you're curious what I'm using to hold down the posters, I have these vintage car lighters. You might have noticed I was selling a lot of vintage lighters at the event. I found thousands of them from this guy who used to deliver products to 7-Eleven. I'm going to meet up with him again, so I'm eventually going to make a video on it. But there were tons of cool lighters. Like, check out this one. It looks like a coffee mug, but it's actually a lighter. There was also this other one that was a toxic waste barrel that's a lighter too. I've never seen weird lighters like this, but they're so fun. These ones are dated 2003 and 2004. And by the way, I'm sorry this video is all over the place. I never know when the right time to talk about stuff is, but this is the perfect time to show off some finds that I can't fit in some of my other shorter videos. I found two of these vintage Philadelphia Phillies posters dated 1996 down here at the bottom. This Dale Earnhardt poster, I'm just going to end up giving away for free when somebody eventually buys one of these posters. It's chewed up down at the bottom and at the top, so I'm not really sure if it's really worth anything, but the artwork is really cool on it. There were a lot more posters than I was expecting because a lot of the rolls actually had multiple posters in there. Like, there were 6 of this exact poster in here. I really like to see this picture. You can see some of the vintage outfits they're wearing. There's also a Gatorade ad here down at the bottom. A few of the posters have the racing schedule on it. I didn't even know they had this many NASCAR races in one year. It's kind of crazy, actually. I typically don't like this kind of poster because the dates take up too much room on the poster and don't leave enough room for the artwork, but there are a few cool ones in here. This Coors Light one is one of my favorites. I don't know why, but the beer cans just look so enticing on here. I'm not sure if that's a picture or if somebody drew that. One thing about this collection is that it ranges from the 80s all the way up into the early 2000s. And the ones from the early 2000s are so obviously from that time period. And when you look at the 80s posters, they're very obviously from the 80s. It's so cool how advertising changed over the years. One of the weird things in this collection was it seemed like a really thick roll of posters, but when I undid them, it turns out to be a vintage car calendar from 1980. It was made by General Tire, and it pretty much just shows the evolution of their tires over the years. It was pretty smart advertising though, because the customer would get this calendar, hang it up in their garage or house, and then look at it every day for an entire year, so they would always be thinking about General Tire. I feel like as a whole, vintage posters are pretty underappreciated in the vintage community. I find them all the time, and they're some of my personal favorite things to find. They're all so cool and different, and you never really know what you're going to unroll when you find a bunch of them. I didn't bring any of these to the vintage event, but I wanted to add them because I did find these with that Valentino sign. Typically, when I find a bunch of vintage posters, a few of them will be too beat up to sell, but a majority of them I will be able to sell. I usually sell them on my website for $28, or if it's a really cool one, maybe $35. It usually costs me around $8 to ship, considering the shipping tube and the price of shipping. And since I find so many of them, it really doesn't cost me too much per poster, so it's definitely a good thing to sell. It's pretty easy to ship out, and it's fun to have up on my website. Something else extremely random that I picked up at the flea market that same day were these taxidermy butterflies. I love finding vintage taxidermy. It's hard to find them for a good price, but I found these for $14, and I ended up selling them for $40. A few years ago at Goodwill, I found a vintage jackalope taxidermy, and I made a TikTok about it. Here it is. A jackalope doesn't actually exist. It's a mythical creature, a mix of a bunny and a deer. And so for this taxidermy, they took a real bunny and put real antlers on it. I ended up selling this thing on eBay for around $300. It was a great sale, but I kind of wish I would have kept it. On the table, you might have also noticed this Yellowstone National Park tray. I found this over the summer at a garage sale. It's from the 60s, and after doing some research on it, there's a bunch of other different national park trays out there. These are so cool. This is such a random, weird thing to collect, so I'm not getting getting into that, but I was trying to sell it for $45 and it didn't sell at each of the shows, so I must have had a price too high. Jumping back to the same day I found all the vintage posters, I also found 4 vintage t-shirts at the flea market. It was a really cold day and there was like nobody there, so these were just sitting out on the table. I didn't even go that early. It was just so cold that like nobody was there. I got these for $5 a piece and I brought them to the last show that I did, and one of them sold for $30, so that was pretty great. Speaking of clothes, I have to mention my favorite pieces of vintage clothing that I brought to the event. Like I mentioned, one of these was held in New Jersey, and recently I found a bunch of vintage Bruce Springsteen merch. So this was like perfect to bring here because New Jersey loves Bruce Springsteen. So around a month ago, I was walking around at an antique store and I saw this vintage Bruce Springsteen shirt. I was shocked though because it was only $25 and it was dated from 1975. And somebody who looks for vintage clothing all the time, I rarely find shirts from the 70s, so I was kind of freaking out. And on the rack, I found some other vintage t-shirts, but when I looked up, I saw 2 vintage Bruce Springsteen tour jackets. Finding a collection like this, I had to buy it all, so here's everything that I picked up. This Bruce Springsteen shirt is super cool. It's from one weekend of shows that he did in 1975, so you can imagine there cannot be that many of these t-shirts that still exist. Although this shirt literally has the date on it, another way to check that this isn't like a reproduction or something is by looking at the sleeves. It's got small sleeves that are typical of shirts from the 70s, and you can look up at the tag. Here's a little tag sheet that I found online of vintage Hanes tags. You can see that this black tag is from the 70s, and that's the one that's on the shirt. As far as vintage jackets go, this might be the coolest vintage jacket I've ever owned. Just check out the color of it, and the fact that it's an original from 1980 is just crazy. The color fading on it is super cool, and I'm really curious how much this retailed for because it could not have been cheap at the time. It only has a little tag on the inside, but it's definitely an original. This other jacket is from his 1988 tour, and you can definitely tell it's from the 80s because it has literal shoulder pads in the shoulders, but the embroidery is super clean on it still. There's nothing on the front, just like the purple jacket, but this is still just another cool jacket. And like I mentioned earlier, I found a few other vintage t-shirts on the rack. Like I found these 2 vintage Southside Johnny and the Jukes t-shirts. This is a band from New Jersey and they did a lot of different things with Bruce Springsteen, so it makes sense on why this would be on the racks. The rest of the t-shirts I found are pretty sick too. Like this Zora one is super badass. It's from 1998. It's got a big graphic on the back and then a small one on the front. The date of 1998 is on the back of the tag, so that's another place to look if you can't find the date of a shirt. So on the back of this Coca-Cola Great Adventure shirt, it has a bunch of different concerts that they held over the summer, and what I didn't realize was that it actually has Southside Johnny and the Jukes on it, so that's obviously why these were all together. I also figured out that the Stone Pony is a bar in New Jersey that Bruce Springsteen got his start at. I ended up selling the yellow Bruce Springsteen shirt to the manager of the Stone Pony, and she was telling me all about everything. So for everything I got at the antique store, I spent around $300 for, and I ended up selling the yellow Bruce Springsteen shirt for $100, the purple jacket for $200, and then a couple of the other shirts for $25 a piece. The black jacket and the 2 Southside Johnny t-shirts have not sold yet, but I'm sure they will soon. One of the other bigger things I had on the table that you might have noticed whenever I was showing the clips at the beginning was this vintage Mad Magazine skateboard. So a month or 2 ago, I was looking on Facebook Marketplace and I saw someone selling a vintage Mad Magazine collection. Now, most of the stuff in the pictures were just Mad magazines, like the actual magazines, and those things, I don't know if they're worth too much. I do find them cool, but I don't really have room for all of those. But what really intrigued me were these rolls of Mad Magazine posters. I've never found any Mad Magazine posters, so I was like, yeah, let's meet up. And I'm happy I did. I ended up buying both the poster rolls and this vintage Mad Magazine skateboard. Let's talk about the posters first. I only found 2 designs. The first one is a Protect Our Wildlife with a bunch of people skinny dipping, and then the other one is more of like a comic strip poster. It has a guy fishing. They're both dated from the 70s, and I found 50 of each design. What I wasn't even expecting to buy, and the thing that I ended up liking the most, is this vintage Mad Magazine skateboard. I was assuming he was going to want too much for it, but I did say I was interested, so he brought it along with him. It's dated 1987, and I ended up getting it for only $70, which I think was a really fair price. The board itself is made by Nash, and I ended up selling it at the event to a Nash skateboard collector, so it was like the perfect person to sell it to. I sold it for $130. I'm sure I could have gotten more if I would have waited, but he seemed super into it, so I thought I would give him a good price. After I sold the Sopranos poster, I ended up displaying one of the Mad Magazine posters up top, and I kept the rest down below, so when people bought them, I just sold them the ones that were under the table, and I also put the Bruce Springsteen jackets up top too. Speaking of posters, if you watched my last video, you'll remember I found a bunch of vintage Wrangler posters at an estate sale. So when I set up at the beginning of this month at Totally Rad Vintage Fest in Pittsburgh, I brought them all out and hung them up above. The smart thing I did was I had a bunch of duplicates underneath the table, so when somebody wanted one up above, I would just go under the table and grab it for them. At the Pittsburgh event, the chachki table was a little bit different because I brought a few beer signs from my dad's vintage beer sign collection. If you guys have seen some of my other videos, my dad collects a lot of vintage stuff, and he's what got me into collecting, so I brought some of his beer signs to sell for him. I ended up selling more than half of them. Here's a little video that I made for TikTok showing off some of the different ones. One of the coolest things he had was his vintage 1997 Miller Lite beer clock, still in its original packaging. It's one of the first things that sold, and it really got me thinking maybe I should be bringing more beer signs and stuff like that to events like this because people were really into them. Another one I wanted to highlight is this Budweiser sign from the 60s. They made a bunch of different nature ones. The one I was selling was the pheasant one, but there's also a fish and a few other different animals. Since most of the events were 2 days long, I tried to spice things up and make things fun. So the one day I brought this big wheel that if you spun it and hit an even number, you got $5 off anything, and if you hit the number that you picked, you get a free t-shirt. I even put pictures of myself in the middle just to be funny. Obviously, as things sold, I would have to move things around on the table and bring new things out, so there's a lot of stuff that I brought that I didn't even talk about in this video. You guys will have to let me know if you enjoyed this video or want to see a part 2 where I talk about anything else that I brought. I realized I filmed basically every aspect of my thrifting life, so I have footage of finding so many of these things. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to my channel, and thanks for watching.